you really have to think about, okay, what kind of sound, how am I going to start this? Okay, maybe I have these instruments here, but what does this really mean? How am I going to approach this? So you research that too, and then maybe you learn new tools and new instruments and new ways of putting sounds together and trying to find other languages. Actually, languages is a good word for this. Sonic languages, other grammars, other technologies, playing with algorithm, in this scenario. And then, you go through all this crazy wave, and then you come to the end and the project's down, and then you're already thinking about the next one. And then you feel like you learned so much, and now you're on top of it. You're so practiced, and all the gear that you have and all the studio time, and then the concept, it just takes you sideways. And you're like, okay, wow, I have to, and then suddenly you have to learn something from scratch.
Welcome to Why Not Both, the podcast all about how our multiple passions shape our identity and our lives. I'm your host, Pam Schaefer, and our producer is Laura Studeris. This season, we are brought to you by Under the Radar magazine. If you like what you hear, you can head over to our Patreon to support us directly and get transcripts of all of our episodes, or you can come hang out with us on your favorite social media platforms, where we can be found under WNB, the podcast. For this week's episode, we got to spend some time with Simone from Soundwalk Collective. I hope that you enjoy our conversation.
Yes, I was in New York. We're working with Patti Smith. We're doing a new project for a show at the Centre Pompidou in Paris. It's opening in the fall, and we've been working with her on basically the realization of what some of this exhibition is going to be about, which has been fun and intense and beautiful. And then I went to Paris. We opened a show at Palais de Tokyo. We did the music for a piece of Hala Wardeh, the Lebanese architect, amazing woman, amazing artist. And we did music for her piece. And now I just came back home, and I'm going to Rome in a couple of days, because actually we have this rotating program at this gallery in Rome, where the Lovotic project is being exhibited. And we curate a program of events. We invite different artists that's been part of this project every month to do either a talk, a conversation, a performance. And on Saturday, we have Charlotte Gainsbourg. She's coming to have a conversation with the curator. So that's going to be really exciting.
Oh, that makes me
yeah.
The sun literally came out as you said that. It was like I started, and the energy of Charlotte Gainsbourg came flooding in.
Just permeating everything, of course.
That's wonderful. And I love that one of the first things that you actually asked me was where I was, because that was the thing that I noticed so much about exploring the world of your work, was that location is like your biggest collaborator. It feels, when I was looking at it, I was like, I wanted to ask you about that, about how it feels when you're doing almost these collaborations in these different places. Like, how does place inform everything that you work on?
Well, since I started to be part of Soundwalk Collective I started in 2007. Sorry, I go a little bit back, but 2000. And the first project when I joined, there was so much about traveling. But literally, we would go on long recording journeys for months, like 3-4 months at a time. The very first project, Ulysses Syndrome, is a very experimental project. We worked with a foundation in the Mediterranean Sea, and we decided the idea was to follow the route of Ulysses in the Odyssey. So we went on this crazy journey for 3.5 months, trying to hit all the spots where he's been recording sound. It was a whole concept about it, how the Mediterranean is dividing the Mediterranean coast, the countries around the coast, but also being the body of water that keeps them together. So it's kind of the separation and sort of union type of in-between area, super interesting to explore. And so, talking about traveling, and it's really like, I feel like traveling, it's almost like this ghostly individual that we collaborate with all the time, like I said. It's really part of it. I think, I guess, moving continuously, and it always allows you to keep perspectives different. And also we collaborate with different artists. It's nice to go into their realm, into all their geographical places, perhaps in their routines, and be able to sort of enter their spaces, if we're allowed to. And, oftentimes we invite them into our space, and oftentimes we like to go into their spaces. And although, it's been quite particular, this collaboration with this last album, Lovotic, it basically all happened during pandemic times.
Yeah.
We started, the first recordings with Charlotte were literally a few days before we left New York. We were based in New York at the time. And we're literally in studio when all the mayhem is happening and no one's understanding what's going on. And we decided maybe we wanted to leave New York and come back to Europe. And from then on, the communication, the collaboration has been online, essentially. We would produce music, would send over material, she would do new takes. We shipped her equipment, we shipped her a microphone. At that time, she couldn't, it was uncomfortable to leave the house. There was different situations. So that was a different experience.
That's fascinating, because then, especially with the theme of the work, like in contrast with, I love the journey of Ulysses, because like the first thing that came to mind, I was like, well, you probably couldn't find Aiea. I was like, probably the one place you couldn't find. I was just like, because Circe's Island is in us all. But I was thinking of, that in contrast with then this project that had so much to do with then in the love of the virtual, that it was crafted in the virtual. I was like, that's fascinating that circumstances conspired to make it so that you were in that virtual space for, I was like, that's strange serendipity.
I think, things just happen. I think, they just happen in unexpected ways, I suppose. I think we're a bit in a path of exploring ideas around the future or possibilities outside our understanding, our physical bodies and minds as we know them. We just before Lovotic, we did a project for Louvre Abu Dhabi. It was a sound installation piece. And we're also exploring, it's basically a soundwalk, actually, I should say. You're walking in the area of the museum under the dome. It's a wonderful architectural creation that instantly makes you think about other worlds and, future places or other planets. It's so inspiring. And Stephan wrote a script for that project, and he was really interested to this idea of looking at the future of humanity. The museum, the Louvre Abu Dhabi, is really designed in such a way that the galleries and the curator and their program is really beautifully done. As you go through the exhibition spaces, you explore the advancement of art from the very beginning of times until today. But you see it in a different perspective, because you see it as all cultures from different parts of the world progressing together in the making of art. And then you start to see connecting points and bridges between different cultures across the board in maybe the same centuries, in the same moments in time. So you have this wonderful progress of human activities in art. And it takes you from thousands of years ago until today. And as you finish the last experience in the last gallery, and then you walk outside into the dome, under the dome, this beautiful piece of architecture. And so we wanted to create something that it's almost like a continuing line. So you finish them, you arrive at the times of today, and then with our sound piece, we take you into the future, looking back at civilization. Wow. And I feel like Lovotic happened at a moment in time. It was almost like a sequel of that in a certain way. We're still with our minds in that process of thinking about us looking at us from a future perspective and, you know, trying to get into that position. And Lovotic has been really an expansion of that. In some ways, definitely in the realm of, you know, sexuality and intimacy, but it's really about the idea of putting yourself in the future, and you can looking back at yourself today, and by looking at yourself from this different perspective, trying to understand what we're all about when it comes to sexuality and identity and who we are, and if we really feel right in the place that we think we are today.
Well, and that brings in, like, I was like, that was 7 sentences colliding in my mind.
Sorry, I always go into this like large.
Oh no, I'm a very galaxy brain kind of thinker. And so everything you were saying, I was like, okay, I want to hold on to that constellation of ideas. I want to hold on to that constellation of ideas. And like, there's all the different pieces coming together. And hilariously, my boyfriend just called, like, while that was happening. I looked down and I saw like his face show up on my phone, and I was thinking of him while you were speaking, even of being in that dome, because he does sound mixing, and he's experimenting with spatial mixing currently.
Wow.
And I was actually thinking about that in that space of like how you could play with the sound, to play with not only like the physical space that you're in, but it creates a different psychological space if you can actually have the different pieces coming from. And I didn't know if you did anything like that in regards to like when you were mixing the sound. That was one of the questions of the 7 that sprang up. Like when you're doing that for the Soundwalk and for installations like that, are you being like, I guess, what's your process about when you are placing sounds in different ways? Like, yeah, tell me more about that, and then I'll get to the other 7.
Yeah, I guess it kind of taps into specialization and about somehow you're relating to sound in a more physical way. Honestly, you know, well, in that specific occasion of the Louvre Abu Dhabi, you know, the piece was created for headphones.
Oh.
And so people were walking with headphones under the dome, and you have, you know, over a half hour, 40 minutes, you explore this narrative that takes you to reflect, you know, around this script that was interpreted by different actors, Charlotte as well, and Willem Dafoe again, and Wim Wenders in German. We had different actors in different languages. But when it comes, in that case, it's really beautiful because you really play with the idea of the voice inside your head, because you're really so close and you can be so intimate. So you have a bit of a different perspective, even if you're like inside the space. Somehow you can play with sound in a physical way, and in a very touchy, very evocative way. You can make it very intimate. But back to specialization, I mean, a beautiful opportunity that we just had, for example, with this Lovotic project, is the exhibition so we opened an exhibition at Forov in Rome in January, couple months before the album came out. And Forov is a new space, an exhibition space in Rome, curated by the curator of the Maxi Contemporary Art Museum. And it's actually born as an archaeological site. Inside that space, they found ruins of a Roman basilica 2,000 years ago. So they found the original marbles. So they decided to open the space up as an art space, basically as a museum.
Wow.
And we were the first artists that were invited to do a site-specific piece. And for us, it was really interesting because, you know, in that specific space, I'll get to the specialization in a minute. In that specific space, you get in touch with, you know, the origins of human society, humankind. You look back at humans 2,000 years ago. And for us, it was so interesting to bring Lovotic in that place, because we do exactly the same, but in the future. We project ourselves in the future and look back at humanity today the same way that today we're looking back at the humans that we were. And by looking back, you look at, you know, all these topics that we unveiled through this project. And the cool thing about that space is that, you know, we created an immersive sound installation. You have to walk 1 floor underground, and then you walk through these corridors and you enter this beautiful big room where you see the original marbles and the ruins. And you're really in a place back in time. But the way we position Lovotic inside of that specific physical space suddenly you lose sense of time and space. You don't know if you're 2000 years ago or 2000 years from now, or where you are and in which place, geographically speaking. Are we on this planet? Are we somewhere else?
Yeah.
And specialization is amazing. We had all these speakers coming from the ceilings at different height.
Yes.
And you have these voices of Charlotte and the other artists that are collaborating, that are sort of calling and displacing all these texts and narratives. I guess, I don't know if that answers your question somehow, but in some ways, I guess, installations are the real possibilities where you can use sound, I feel like, in a physical way, and playing with perception and playing with sonic holograms in a certain way, and sort of with perceived sound and imaginary sound. And this project was just so perfect to allow us to get into all these layers, because there's so much of, the voice in this project is so important. It's really like an oracle. It's like a portal, a different space in time, or to a different, in this case, artificial mind. And the voice is continuously moving in between places, identities, perhaps, and you always perceive it in a different way, and it's always talking to you. So working with that in a three-dimensional space is fantastic.
That's what's so fascinating to me about what you said, also, not just with like the technological specification, but also like adding the dimension of time to space, because that's a really interesting thing to play with. Like, I love that perspective of like, you could be looking 2000 years back or 2000 years forward. I think of what someone once said to me, where they were like, if you're looking for your best advice, look to yourself in the future. What would yourself in the future say to you? And so sometimes I imagine like the me in the future, but it's funny because even in my mind's eye, the me in the future looks alarmingly like the me now. And so I've always been like, time's a little bit of a squishy concept. Go on.
I mean, you just make me think that how, when you said you were trying to imagine yourself in the future, it's incredible how we have such an inability to do that. Obviously, it's so difficult to imagine, the future. And, if Stephan would be here, he would say, the future doesn't exist. It's a product of the mind.
Yeah.
Because, and the past maybe as well, in a different sort of, in a different level, we only know the now, and then the rest is just projections of our imagination.
Yes, there's just like, one is future holograms, the other is past holograms. They're all and that's fascinating to look forward and back at the same time. And especially like, it's such, I don't know, I feel like it's a pivotal point, because this is really the first era where we have been able to connect virtually in this way. And I find the virtual space fascinating. I mean, even currently we're connecting virtually, despite the fact that like we began speaking of where we are physically. It's like, we've crafted this little virtual bubble for about an hour. This exists. And then like, it's really strange sometimes when, I don't know if you have this feeling, but when I hang up a Zoom call, it's almost like I feel like I've burst a little bubble. It's like a little soap bubble is like, boop, and like that thing doesn't exist again.
Yeah.
And it's interesting to create art within that.
Definitely. I was just thinking while you were saying that this said, it's funny how the first question that we, like I just did with you today, first question that we ask each other, it's like, oh, so where are you? Also, because considering what happened in the past 2 years, people change locations, and, we're all still. So it's interesting. And I may have lost the thread of the question you were going for.
It's too funny because someone asked me one time, they're like, what's the format of your podcast? And I'm like, talking to people. And they're like, no, but what's the format? I was like, that is the format. That is the whole format. It is a conversation. Because how often do you get to have like a one-on-one conversation that's just a focused conversation? Oftentimes there's so many things happening around us. Even like I was interrupted prior to even hopping on the Zoom call, that it's so rare that you get to just be like, no, we're having a one-on-one conversation.
Yeah. That's really what it is. Yeah. And that's really pretty amazing as well. because you creating this space where, you're feeling that we're here together discussing different, topics, but without necessarily a scope or a specific end. It's just like we're being here together and sharing the space.
Yeah. It had started with, and the reason I was drawn to your work in particular is that it had started with people who do multiple things, hence the title, Why Not Both? But the more I spoke to people, the more I learned, like, I don't think I've met really a unidimensional person. I think we have this illusion of a uni-passionate or unidimensional person. And so far, I don't think they exist, or I haven't met them yet. Like, I was like, I don't know if they're out there. If they're out there, contact me.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how to elaborate on this one.
Yeah, because that's what was so compelling, is that your work drew together so many different things, and even as you're speaking about it, you're collating all of this information about space and about time and about different artists and about different eras, and even like the formats that you're speaking of change project to project.
Yeah.
And I was like, that's fascinating. Like,
yeah, we really do. I feel like, the funny thing is that in every project that we get into, it's funny, you go for a project, it could take, like Lovotic took maybe, I don't know, 3 years, and you really go through a journey, and you go through so much. You get really in touch with things personally. Sometimes you go too far. I don't know, but you also learn so many things, you because you study, one of the first aspects of our production. So when Stephan is the one that conceives the ideas, is the visionary mind. And so as soon as he has something in mind, the first thing he does is like ordering books. So you'll see boxes and boxes of books coming to the studio, like endless books everywhere. And then the research is starting. And so you get so much in touch with things, and then you learn about things that you didn't know, or you process them, you see them in a different way. And then that comes words in his part of the process. Then together we transfer that into music. But when you work on music, working on projects that are so concept-based, you really have to think about, okay, what kind of sound, how am I going to start this? Okay, maybe I have these instruments here, but what does this really mean? How am I going to approach this? So you research that too, and then maybe you learn new tools and new instruments and new ways of putting sounds together and trying to find other languages. Actually, languages is a good word for this. Sonic languages, other grammars, other technologies, playing with algorithm, in this scenario. And then, you go through all this crazy wave, and then you come to the end and the project's down, and then you're already thinking about the next one. And then you feel like you learned so much, and now you're on top of it. You're so practiced, and all the gear that you have and all the studio time, and then the concept, it just takes you sideways. And you're like, okay, wow, I have to, and then suddenly you have to learn something from scratch. Some things apply, some things don't. And it's really been like this. It's really, really been like this, for the whole time that we've been working together, honestly. Projects are connected, like, projects that are realized back to back, they're clearly connected. But if I look at the first one and the last one, it's such a big difference in so many ways, in the way they're realized, in the way they're thought, in the way, they're conceived, they're presented, they're recorded, so yeah.
I love that you can kind of track your adventure by these little like station points of the real life projects. But if you looked at, say, like project 1 and then this project, you'd be like, wait, how did I get from there? It's like you're like, what dance
something like this.
I follow? Like, where?
Yeah, something like this, actually.
That's so interesting to think about
I love that it starts with a box of books. This is the room where all of my instruments are. The other room in my home is where all of the books are. So I was just like, box of books speaks to me. But so does pile of instruments. And I was like, gosh, what did you, I guess, like, what came to you for Lovotic specifically? Because it was virtually geographic. And so I was like, oh, how interesting. Like, what tools came to you in that project?
Well, things come to us always in a bit of an organic way, and then you kind of listen to the signals and you try to follow them, and you hope that they lead you into the right direction or what you think may be right. But so like I was saying earlier, we're in New York and we're in the process of moving, pandemic started, we're like moving back to Europe, trying to find a place where we're going to be together, that we can actually work together, knowing that all the countries are closing down and which passport you have and which passport I have and my wife and
oh
whatever.
My God. It's a logistical.
So all of that. And so what we did is that we basically packed the gear that we had in a couple cases. It was mostly modular synthesizers and a bunch of other tools. And that's what we traveled with. And so we relocated and that's all we had.
Oh, wow.
But it turned out that it was actually quite of a new setup that we were working on. And so that really became the sort of the initial tools that we used to experiment with. And it turned out that it was actually a really great approach for this project to explore with, maybe I should do a step back. Most of our recent work up until this project has elements of electronic instruments, but never that much. It's always been combined. There's always a lot of field recordings. Our work has always been around field recordings.
Yeah.
Going to places and recording sound and collecting huge libraries and trying to find sound that actually had, special meaning and sort of could really work in the concepts we're working with. And then, in the projects that we did recently with Patti Smith, there's a lot of acoustic instrumentation as well, because the concepts took us there, tour in the north of Mexico and working with the Raramuri Indians from the Sierra and what instruments they use, and it's self-made instruments. And so
I was just like, bookmark in my head, tell me more about that, but keep talking. I was just like, oh my God, I want to know more about that one. Keep going.
And so those projects, they're really acoustic in nature. There is electronic instrumentation, but it's always very acoustic sounding, very warm. There's some physical moments, but it's primarily an acoustic, like, how should I say, not a synthetic experience.
Right. I was going to say that you have the tactile, but also the tactile and geographical and cultural are all kind of, that was,
yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, and basically when we came to this project, it's funny how all we carried in these two luggages were modular synthesizers that we could and suddenly we're working on this project that's, projected so much into the future. And we find ourselves having, for the first time, actually no field recording present in the whole project. It's actually the first project ever that we did that has actually no field recording. And so it's born in so much more of a synthetic way.
I like how my brain went, but you did get field recordings. You just got field recordings of the synthetic nature. Like that's their field. I was like, that's where they hang out. 100%. You got it from the field of the sine waves. I was just like,
yes, that's 100%. Absolutely. No, very true, actually.
Like, I want to go where the sine waves live.
That's where we travel to, somewhere.
They're my favorite of all the waves. I mean, you got to get a good saw wave in there occasionally, but the sine waves, I'm like,
There's pure tones and,
yes.
so synthetic and so real.
I love that that's what you grabbed. I just imagine, like, most people ask, like, if something's on fire, like, what are the things that you grab? I'm like, you grabbed your suitcase of the modulars. Like, it's an emergency. We got to get them.
the biggest panic of that moment was literally like, how are we going to be able to work?
Yes.
Where are we going to go and how we're going to be able to work, and Steph he's always thinking, we have this kind of duality. He's always looking at all the possible scenarios. I'm always looking at the bright side of things. Oh, it's going to be fine. And he's like, no, hold on. This can happen and that can happen, and we got to be prepared. So combination of these two things, actually his approach here was actually really helpful, because he was able to arrange the situation where we could be for the next 4 months in case whatever happened.
Yeah. You got to bring, my friends joke about this in my personality. They call it the Jewish mom vibes. Like, you got to be prepared. That's usually like, do you have a jacket? Do you have a snack? Do you have
Yeah.
So I like that he brings that. And I like that it's so interesting listening to also like the dynamic of your collaboration with each other. I always love talking to people about that, because it's like, sometimes I find in bands or collectives or, any kind of collaboration, sometimes it's like one person brings the practicality, the other person brings like the vibes, or it's like one person brings the ideas and like the other person is like, I know how to execute that. But it sounds like in a way the two of you trade off really well. Like, I was like, that's really cool.
Yeah. I mean, I really do think we have I really think we have a really complementary nature.
Yeah.
And, we're aligned in the sense that, we're driven towards same things aesthetically and conceptually, but we really operate in different ways. And it's amazing and lucky to see how the different ways we operate actually will really work well with each other, because we really have things that the other person doesn't have, generally speaking. Yeah. And then we come together in studio, and also in the studio, that's kind of what happens, We do things in very different ways. And so the cool thing about that is that the other person's bringing ideas that you would actually never think of. You'd be like, oh, wow, what happened here? How, I would never approach that in that way, and vice versa. And then you get really surprised. Yeah. And then, you kind of explore things in that way. It's really interesting. It's challenging, because you are working oftentimes with things that maybe are outside your natural territory. You're like, okay, maybe I would approach this that way. And then suddenly you discover that, it takes you out of the comfort zone. And this is actually amazing for creative work.
Yes, that feeling of, I would have never done it that way, but I'm very excited by it.
And basically also realizing that, coming to terms with different ways of doing things. That basically. But you said earlier something about, talking about the duos and primarily I think you mentioned, in one of your examples, one has this idea and the other person's executing. We have a bit of that. In the general, in the general nature that we both have. Stephan is coming with a lot of concepts and research and ideas and figuring out who to collaborate with and creating all that kind of sort of umbrella. And then we discuss ideas together, and I start to experiment with things when I have something and bring it to the table, and then we join forces and we continue production together. So it's interesting.
And then with all the traveling, like you had mentioned, I was just like, I bookmarked in my head the self-made instruments, because you were even saying like, on each of these projects, you learn new instruments. But I was like, tell me more about that, because I'm just curious. I'm like, what kinds of instruments were these? How do you play them? What does it sound like?
Well, in the end, there are probably versions of instruments that we already know, but specifically, this was the first project in a series of 3 trilogy of albums that we did with Patti Smith the past few years. And it's called the Peyote Dance. And it is inspired by Antonin Artaud's period in the Sierra Tarahumara in northern Mexico. So he left in 1936 and he went to live in a cave up in the northern Mexico, in this place called Sierra Tarahumara. I don't know how he got there. And he lived among the Raramuri Indians. And these people, wonderful people, they one of the centers of their culture is spirituality and spiritual ceremonies, and music and dancing and peyote and other sort of substances. And Anthony Artaud, by spending time there, our thought is that he was able to, by going so far into someone else's culture, you transcend yourself and you transcend your own culture, you transcend the borders, physical and mental. And this is one of the angles that we took when we started to explore this project. We looked at the travels of Artaud, Rimbaud, and Domal, these free French poets that are very close to, Patty's very close to them and very inspired by their work throughout her career and life. And so we looked at these wonderful artists and what happened to them when the idea of travel and exploration and geography and how that maybe back in time was already, tapping into the idea of clearing, of erasing borders. Physical or mental, like I was saying, but going back to the specificities of the Selfmade instruments of the Alamori Indians, they would build their own instruments for their rituals and practices. And so, from certain variations of guitar or their own self-made violins, which is very specific sound. And they have this instrument called the chapaleque, which is essentially a long piece of a stick of wood with a few strings attached, and you have to place your lips very close, and they use the mouth as a resonance. So while you pluck it, there's a vibration into the lips and the mouth, and it creates a resonance that gives this kind of, and then you move your mouth, making a kind of wow, 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 and that's, and you're giving the shape.
God, you're like a human theremin.
Yeah, kind of. It's more stringy, more metallic and stringy, but yeah, very, very. They're all instruments. The way they use them, they produce such entrancing sounds, And so, but aside from those instruments, and there's different types of this. Well, of course, there's tribal drums, beautiful handmade and hand painted drums, and there's different kinds of bells and that they use. But then there's also objects that they use in these rituals and ceremonies, and they make sound. For example, one of the main rituals in the ceremony is has a specific name that doesn't come to me now, but is a way to crush the peyote with a specific tool called the raspa, which is a stick of wood that has some dents, and then there's a specific bowl that they use, and that's how they prepare the plant. And all those things make super interesting sounds.
Yes.
Something becomes a rhythm, and then there's the rocks, and then there's the leaves, and then there's the horse, and then there's the chants that they make. And so it becomes a really super interesting, entrancing, and hallucinatory sonic journey that we try to translate into this album, and Patty channeling the words of Artaud.
It's strange that this is the third time that Antonin Artaud has come up in conversation casually in the last week in my life. I'm like, okay, all right, I see you. Not usually a common one to pop up. So I'm like, maybe I need to delve back in to his work. It's like interesting. And I was wondering, have you heard or worked at all with the artist John Hopkins? He just made an album, Music for Psychedelic Therapy, that's actually in a way like similarly crafted in concept, but very different in execution. And I was like, oh, do you two know of one another or know each other? I was just like,
yes. I know of him, but I don't know this album, and I'm just gonna go right into it right after.
Yes,
this.
I was just like,
thank you for the gift here.
Yes, it was fascinating. I got to speak with him about his process that he also, like, for the album, did record in very specific places and use space and ceremonial space in a similar way. And so I was just like, I was like, how do I get all of you in the same room? Like,
That would be amazing.
I feel as though you have a lot to talk about.
Yeah.
Because it's fascinating to me to create even like ceremonial and psychological space for things in that manner. Like I actually have like a group therapy practice. Like that's when I'm not doing this or doing that. I also do therapy, and I just hired someone in my practice that does psychedelic integration work. And so hearing even about you in a way sonically recreating that space, like I'm so excited to be able to share that with her, because she was talking to me about like creating ceremonial space in general for like for plant medicine work, and that in some ways like the Western world has imposed like the Western medicinal view on it, which really just is the only way I know how to say that. It's just kind of like taking something interesting and flattening it into one strata and making it not work correctly. And so I'm going to have to share all this music with her, because I think she'll find that so interesting. She was talking even about how to craft sonic space and emotional space within ceremony space. And without, because I do think that if you aren't from a culture, I like what you said about the Artaud, literally, like, because my first thought, I was just like, I wonder what they thought of Artaud when he first went to the cave. They were like, what's that guy doing over there? And he seems chill. He doesn't mean any harm. Maybe we'll say hi to the man in the cave. But it's like, you want to be careful not to accidentally like put on the costume of another culture in a way, but to, like you said, transcend oneself and transcend the idea of that, and tap into more of the universal.
Yeah.
So
no, it's tricky. I mean, inevitably, I believe that we all inspire each other, and especially you come in touch with realities that are far from yours. There's so much place for inspiration, and I think that's what really happened to us. And when we got in touch, when we get in touch with the people that we collaborate in these many projects, and oftentimes there is just so much that is unexpected. And like I was saying earlier, you find yourself in someone else's space, physical, mental, spiritual, and it's really a gift to be able to be there, to be accepted into that space. And if you are able to be open to it and to listen, I think there's just so much that can give you. And that's a form of collaboration already, this kind of exchange,
Yeah. That really is a gift when someone welcomes you into their space like that, because it's vulnerable, like letting someone into your space. Like I remember reading about even when, oh gosh, I wish I had the book in front of me so I could cite it correctly, but Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, where he was talking about the people who were visiting people performing ceremony, that initially, like one of the women that was guiding ceremony was inviting people in to like see what happened. But then I believe it was like National Geographic, someone wrote an article about it that popularized it in the Western world, that then led to like a lot of the research that then went on in the 60s, that then she perceived it as like that she had actually brought this horrible curse into like, that she had ruined it somehow by inviting people in. And what it spoke to me of is like, that if someone does invite you in, it's to have like the utmost respect for that. Like you don't want to walk into someone's house and just like, be like, oh, cool, I really like that vase, I'll take it home with me, bye.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I just had to think of the work of Vincent Moon. Do you know him?
No.
He's a French filmmaker, and we collaborated on a project some years ago. And he has been documenting ritual practices that primarily involve music to some form since ever, basically, and with very low, with very not necessarily high-end equipment or crazy cameras, just very simple stuff. And he travels like no one else I know, honestly, because he's going literally to the corners of the world to, to encounter tribes and different peoples live in different ways. And his work is very inspiring because it's documented in a very, you really feel like you're inside what you see. You're together with these people, and he's able to create that bridge, and he's able to be accepted somehow, and be able to carry out this collaborative documentation of what's happening and transfer that to the people who actually watch his films. So oftentimes he does screening, he's constantly traveling, doing screenings all over the place of different things that he's been filming. And for that moment, you're entranced. It's entrancing, and you really get in touch with practices that you would, honestly, I feel like I would probably never know of. And I think it's beautiful that there's a possibility to do that as well. Yeah. And knowing that it's a very fine line, and it's, when you enter other people's spaces, it's delicate, and it could take different consequences and different meanings. And I think he's been able to work tastefully, and his work is inspiring also for because of that way that he does it. If you have the chance to look at Vincent Moon.
Vincent Moon. I was just like, Vincent.
Wonderful artist.
I'm going to keep repeating it to myself so I remember his name, because I love what you said about even the ritual of sound. I was speaking with my boyfriend about this because we were talking about how he had never really experienced, like now he goes every week because he does sound for Shabbat services for one of the organizations in Los Angeles, that and they use a lot of, like, the first time I went to their services, they use a lot of unusual cadences in some of like the traditional prayers and some of the songs. Like there were some that I had heard before, but there were some that I actually hadn't. And so I was researching like all the different things that they were doing, and I found it fascinating. And he finds it fascinating too, because he's like, people are coming together in a way for this ritual of sound, because for the most part, people aren't fluent in Hebrew. They might memorize like what the prayers mean in certain cases, but other than that, it's like you're coming all together to have this sonic ritual every week. And he and I were talking about how fascinating that is. And we're like, why do people need sonic ritual? What's the meaning of that? Why do we do this? And I was curious now, like that you mentioned the documentary, I was like, do you have any like sonic rituals, or what does it feel like to you when you're engaging in that?
Yeah, well, as you were speaking about this, you tapped into the idea of what happens when you don't understand the language, and how you perceive that. And I think it's really amazing, because it's an amazing experience, because the voice, the sound and the voice, they really become something else. They could carry so many other meanings, and voice can have so much other, it can be used for so many other things, not just express a message through the meaning of a word, I did have to think a bit about Lovotic as well, because the way Stephan put together the scripts and this text and this kind of the way they're rearranged in a way that maybe makes sense and maybe not quite. Sometimes you follow the meaning, maybe you make sense, maybe a sentence makes sense, it takes you somewhere, a group of sentences, and then maybe it doesn't, and the voice just remains as a voice. And there one specific track, Reverse the Scores. Oops, sorry.
That's no worries.
we worked with we work with Lyra Pramuk on this album, and she performs on this track Reverse the Scores, and we had this amazing studio section, which actually was a total ritual by itself. And it was the first time that we've met in person. She comes to the studio in Berlin, we exchange, and then, about the ideas and where we want to go. And then she goes to the mic, and it's amazing because her first instinct was to produce sound and trying to utilizing her voice in an unintelligible way, meaning, how am I saying this?
Like not
using words that they don't have a meaning, or give the feeling that they're read backwards, or just playing with that idea.
Yes.
And that was amazing in the context of what we're doing, because in this project, there's so much about the voice. And it kind of becomes a ritual in itself when there's repetition, when there's a lot of repetition, repeating words. There's like little mantras popping up. You know, in the first track, Atom TM added this little line at the end, playing off from words that Willem Dafoe is performing on the track, which is Willem is talking about number 0, future, and Atom TM jumps in and he makes a mantra. 0, 1, love, future. And the voices, the words, they overlap each other and they change orders, and it becomes like the sonic mantra. And then Lara is doing something similar in that territory with her voice, which is much more operatic, and you have the feeling that the voice is like on a backward reverb or going backwards, and she's doing all these words that actually have no meaning. And all this are experiments are so evocative because they really expand your perception in that moment, because you stop listening to certain things and you listen to other things. You know, and I think, I'm not sure, but I think that maybe there's nothing else that can be so so intimate and so direct like the human voice. You know, or the voice in general, and so powerful in how that can really, you know, maybe just the tonality can have can transfer a certain feeling or message or intention. You know, maybe there's a sense of intimacy or arousal. Maybe the words take you somewhere completely different, but the tonality takes you in a colliding place. It's very interesting to play with that. And that's been one of the most interesting elements of the realization of this album as well. The presence of the voices and how everyone's coming together. Paul Preciado is taking you he's the intelligible voice. He's, you know, reading a text and interpreting a text, and he's using meaning, and he's taking you in a philosophical plane outside of, you know, the expected, you know, with words, and with 2 different languages, English and Spanish. So everyone's kind of using the voice in a very different way. And you have all these layers and complexities, and this depth that are being created. And some are more human, some are more non-human, or whatever we think that might be. And you're in this constant place of exploration and constantly invited by these artists' spaces. Which is quite special,
Yet again, it goes back to what we were speaking of at the beginning of, like, kind of playing with space-time and with perspective, that it's like using the human voice, but like if it's in the location of, you know, the sign field, it's like, it's so interesting tying all of that together, because, and I really like what you said about that the human voice can evoke meaning beyond like the meaning of words, which obviously that has its own meaning. But like the way that you used people's voices to evoke spiritual, emotional, like all of those meanings, that even if someone doesn't know what the words mean, or in particular, if they're almost recognized as phonemes but aren't words. Like I love that Jonsi does that in Sigur Rós, that he created, I think he called it Hopelandic, where it was like based on kind of like Icelandic phonemes, but it's not Icelandic. And I think that's so interesting when people do that, because as someone who, like I said, I love the piles of books. So there's a part of me that almost like clings to words as a life raft, being like, yes, but then I'll understand. And it's that feeling of, it's okay if you don't understand this. You sometimes don't need the pile of books.
No, when you mentioned Jonsi, you know, it's fun. I had to think, it's amazing what you said. It's so true, so inspiring. And it's funny how, you know, I mean, I had a huge Sigur Rós phase some time ago, and, you know, you get to, you know, you sing along.
Yes.
You make sounds, you know, you listen to the, you know, and because it's so emotional, that's what you have to do. You listen to the music and you know the voice is going to do that and it's going to take you there, and you just go along with it, whatever you think that may be, you just do it. And that's the way that you connect most strongly with, in a case, the music, and the emotion that it transfers to you. Yeah,
Yeah.
I
And
know it's
that
powerful.
it's beautiful. And even thinking about Sigur in general, I feel like I actually did understand the music more when I finally actually did go to Reykjavik and I went to Iceland. It's like there was something that like clicked. It was like a little tumbler clicked in my head where like, of course, like I resonated with it before, but then understanding the location where it came from. And same with like, I was obsessed with Bjork when I was a teenager. Like it was like understanding being there, it felt different. And I was like, it's like the feeling of the music. I was like, I get it now here.
Wow.
Like,
Wow. Yeah, I'm a bit envious because I would love to go there, and I've been really wanting to go there. And when I lived in New York in the beginning, I actually had a lot of Icelandic friends, and they're all amazing musicians.
yes.
Some became extremely famous, and they were not at the time. So it's also beautiful to see that.
Yes.
And it had a huge fascination because of that. I don't know, organic connection that happened. I ended up, having a lot of Icelandic friends when I was in New York, and always be surrounded by music.
Yes.
And the first time I met Bjork, I was actually on a layover in Reykjavik, and
Yes.
I was a kid, and she's in front of me in the queue outside of the plane. I was like, what am I doing? How do I do this? Yeah, I didn't do anything.
Right?
But I just saw it all happen in my head.
That's hilarious. I know that someday I'm going to awkwardly be in one of the pools in Reykjavik and just see Bjork from afar and be like, Reykjavik is like a tiny town. I forget that because like I went to Airwaves a few years ago and just fell in love with the location and also fell in love with the people there. Like much like you, I actually have like several good friends in Iceland now. And it's fascinating to me that it's such a musical culture, but it's like the music is just folded in. It's not like seen as like extraordinary to be a musician.
Sure.
Of course you're a musician and also you built a house and also maybe you're an engineer and like here's this fish that you prepared. Like it's just seen as, you just do that stuff. And one of my friends said to me, they were like, well, there's not that many people here. If you're gonna do something, like you just have to do it. Or like work together with someone else to do it. Right. There's no one else around. And so I was like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way.
Yeah.
But I love their musical culture so much because it's very informed by where they are. It's informed by isolation, but it's informed by the fact that like people do come visit their country because it's perceived as like this alien landscape. And in a way it kind of is because it's so geographically isolated. But just, I love working on music with my Icelandic friends because they're kind of down for anything.
I would love to experience Iceland, but mostly like probably for the reason that you just described, this kind of connection. I don't know, somehow there is some kind of connection between the landscape and the music, as simple as that may sound. And as simple as that may sound, I think, I have the impression there is something there happens in that way.
I would love for you to go, like simply because of everything you've been talking about. I was like, oh, the interaction between you and Iceland. I'm like, oh yes.
Okay, we'll put it in the book for the next round.
Yes, I was just like, I'm flinging you into Iceland. It was walking along the harbor that like I remember even reflecting on like Bjork's song, like the Anchor song, and like even thinking about where she's singing in what song is it? It's Hyper Ballad, where she's like throwing the items off the cliff so that she remembers she's in love with someone. Like until I actually like was in those places, I mean it, like I got the emotion of it, but I didn't get it.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then being there, it's like, oh. Okay.
It kind of goes back a little bit to where we started today, with the idea of the traveling and having to be there. And it's just, sometimes that's just how you have to do it, to just really be in touch.
You just have to fling yourself into the place.
Yeah.
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 Thank you for being so generous with your time in this virtual.
No, thank you so much. Yes. See, the lights have dimmed a little bit.
Thank you again for listening to this episode of Why Not Both? If you liked what you heard, please make sure to like us and subscribe to us on your preferred podcast platform. You can also come hang out with us on social media. We are at WNB the podcast, both on Instagram and on Twitter. This season, we are brought to you by Under the Radar magazine. Under the Radar is a nationally distributed print, music, and entertainment magazine and website. You can find them at www.undertheradarmag.com and feel free to support them on Patreon. Extra special thanks to our producer, Laura Studeris, who is literally a rock star. Thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you next episode.